The courtroom was tense, thick with the weight of accusation and disbelief. Sarah, a wealthy white woman dressed impeccably, sat at the stand, her tear-streaked face turned toward the jury. She had one goal today, to make the courtroom believe her version of events. Through sobs, she recounted the night her young son, Ethan, disappeared. He was playing outside, and then he was just gone. Sarah cried, her voice trembling. She paused, gathering herself before directing a shaking finger at Darren, her black neighbor who sat silently at the defendant's table. That man took my son." Sarah's voice echoed through the room as her gaze locked on Darren, filled with anger and accusation. Her words painted Darren as a monster, a villain who had preyed on her family in the dead of night. Darren, a family man known throughout the neighborhood for his kindness, stood silently, his face hard but calm. Inside, though, he was shocked. This was the woman he had waved at for years from his front yard, the woman whose son had played near his home many times. Now, she was accusing him of the unthinkable, kidnapping her child. The room shifted uncomfortably, the tension rising as Sarah's claims hung in the air. Despite her emotional plea, Darren remained resolute, shaking his head slowly in disbelief. He knew he was innocent. He knew the truth would come out. But what Sarah and even the judge didn't know was that the truth, the evidence about to be revealed, would turn this entire case upside down. Neither of them saw it coming. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the atmosphere in the suburban neighborhood had always been deceptively quiet. On the surface, it looked like any other peaceful, middle-class community. But beneath that calm exterior, racial tensions simmered, unspoken but ever-present. Sarah had lived in her home for years, enjoying the quiet, comfortable life her wealth afforded. When Darren and his family moved into the house next door, things began to change, at least in Sarah's eyes. Though Darren was nothing but polite, Sarah could never quite shake the discomfort she felt about having a black family living next to hers. Small disputes between them had become almost routine. Sarah complained about everything: Darren's kids playing too loudly, the music at their family gatherings, even the way they parked their cars. Each time, Darren would respond calmly, always trying to de-escalate the situation. He wasn't one for conflict, especially not over such trivial matters. But no matter how polite or accommodating he tried to be, Sarah's irritation only grew. Sarah's discomfort ran deeper than simple neighborly annoyances. She didn't like Darren's presence, and though she never voiced it outright, her actions spoke volumes. She would ignore him when they passed on the street, avoiding eye contact, and often pulled her son away if he was playing near Darren's yard. Her feelings, shaped by years of unspoken prejudice, were now coming to a head. Then came the night when Ethan, Sarah's young son, went missing. It was a warm summer evening, and the children in the neighborhood had been playing outside. When Ethan didn't return home, Sarah panicked. In her frantic search for an explanation, her mind immediately turned to Darren. She didn't trust him, and her fear quickly spiraled into suspicion. The tension that had been quietly growing between them finally exploded. Sarah's accusations escalated in the blink of an eye. She was certain Darren had something to do with her son's disappearance, and in her desperation, she reported him to the police, spinning a story that cast Darren as the villain. As the accusations spread through the neighborhood, the unease between the two families reached a boiling point. Neighbors, who had always been friendly, now whispered behind closed doors, unsure of what to believe. Darren, meanwhile, was left stunned, wondering how his efforts to keep peace had led to such a horrific misunderstanding. What Sarah didn't realize was that her deep-seated prejudices were about to come back to haunt her. The more she pushed, the closer the truth came to the surface, and it was a truth that would change everything. The night the police arrived at Sarah's home was chaotic. Flashing lights bathed the quiet street in a harsh red and blue glow. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, drawn by the sound of sirens and the frantic voice of Sarah, who stood on her front lawn, her face flushed and wild with panic. "He took him. He took my son," Sarah cried, pointing toward Darren's house. Her voice was shrill, her accusations sharp and unwavering. The officers listened as she recounted her version of events, her hysteria fueling their urgency. In her mind, there was no doubt. Darren was responsible for her son's disappearance. But the truth was far more complicated, and the officers didn't ask enough questions. In moments, they were knocking on Darren's door. He answered, confused and disoriented from the sudden commotion. Maria, his wife, stood beside him, their children huddling behind her as the officers demanded Darren come outside. The shock in Darren's eyes was unmistakable. He hadn't done anything wrong. How could this be happening? What's going on? Darren asked, his voice calm but laced with confusion. The lead officer's tone was cold and authoritative. We're responding to a report of a missing child. You're under suspicion of kidnapping. Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. Kidnapping? Are you serious? Darren didn't do anything. But the officers weren't listening. Sarah's frantic accusations had already painted the narrative in their minds. They saw Darren not as a neighbor, but as a suspect. Without much investigation or any concrete evidence, they moved swiftly, handcuffing Darren right there in front of his family. Please, you can't do this, Maria cried, grabbing at one of the officers, desperate to stop them. Her voice cracked with emotion, her eyes pleading, but her cries fell on deaf ears. The officers pushed her back, their focus solely on Darren. The neighborhood, once peaceful, was now buzzing with whispers. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching in stunned silence as Darren was led away in handcuffs. The shock of the moment rippled through the community. Darren, a man known for his kindness and generosity, was being treated like a criminal. But the most heartbreaking part was the look on his children's faces, wide-eyed with fear, unable to understand why their father was being taken from them. I didn't do this, Darren said quietly as he was placed in the back of the squad car, the gravity of the situation sinking in. His words went unheard. As the car pulled away, the neighborhood was left in an uneasy quiet. Darren's family stood frozen, Maria's tears falling as she clutched their children tightly, watching the man they loved disappear into the night. Little did the police know, they had just arrested an innocent man, and the truth, the real truth, was about to shake the foundations of everything Sarah and the community believed. The courtroom was tense, filled with murmurs as Sarah took the stand. All eyes were on her as she adjusted her posture, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to recount her story. Dressed in muted tones, her face was pale, her expression a mix of grief and determination. The air felt thick as everyone waited for her to speak. My son, Sarah began, her voice cracking as she wiped away tears. He was everything to me. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. The jury, the judge, and the spectators watched closely, captivated by her sorrow. She explained the events of the day Ethan disappeared. It was a normal afternoon. I was inside, cleaning up, and Ethan was playing outside, just like any other day. Her voice softened, and she took a breath, as if reliving the moment in her mind. I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw him, Darren. He was standing near our fence, watching Ethan. Her words were slow, deliberate, designed to paint Darren as something sinister. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. I thought it was strange, she continued. He looked suspicious, like he was waiting for something. Sarah's eyes darted to where Darren sat, still silent and stoic. She avoided meeting his gaze for too long, but her accusation lingered in the room like a heavy fog. Her voice grew louder, more emotional. And then, when I looked again, Ethan was gone. I searched everywhere, but I just knew. I knew Darren had something to do with it. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Sarah's tears had a powerful effect, moving many in the audience. Even though there was no real evidence backing her claims, the emotional weight of her testimony seemed to tip the scales against Darren. Her sobs filled the room, tugging at the hearts of those who wanted to believe the worst. To the jury, Sarah's pain was palpable, and her words created a vivid picture of a mother who had lost everything. Darren, in contrast, remained calm, but it was clear that Sarah's portrayal of him, this supposed predator lurking in the neighborhood, had begun to sway the courtroom's perception. But despite the intensity of her testimony, there was one glaring truth that couldn't be overlooked. There was no evidence. Nothing solid tied Darren to the disappearance of Ethan, but in the heat of Sarah's emotions, facts seemed secondary to feelings. Her tears and trembling voice painted Darren as a man to fear, and the courtroom was left grappling with the weight of her words. The prosecution leaned in, capitalizing on Sarah's emotional breakdown to hammer their point home. But beneath the surface, something was off. Darren's defense attorney, though outwardly composed, knew the tide had turned against them for now. But they also knew something else. Emotions might sway the jury in the moment, but the truth, the evidence that was yet to be revealed, would change everything. As Sarah left the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted, and Darren's future looked darker than ever. But what Sarah and the court didn't realize was that her carefully constructed narrative was about to unravel in ways no one could have predicted. As the courtroom settled after Sarah's tearful testimony, the atmosphere felt heavy with bias. The jury, swayed by Sarah's emotional recounting, had already begun to see Darren through a distorted lens. But now it was time for the defense to push back, and Darren's attorney, Michael Harris, knew he had his work cut out for him. Michael stood, adjusting his tie before approaching the jury, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's take a step back and examine the facts, or rather, the lack of them." His tone was measured, but there was an edge of urgency to his words. He had to cut through the emotional fog Sarah had cast over the courtroom. He turned to face the jury. Sarah's accusations are based solely on her assumptions. She claims that Darren was acting suspiciously, that he somehow took her child. But where is the proof? He paused, letting the silence weigh on the room. There is no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses, nothing but Sarah's word. The jury shifted slightly, the weight of Michael's words beginning to register. He glanced briefly at Sarah, who sat with her head down, clutching a tissue tightly, before focusing back on the jury. "Now, I understand the grief and fear that comes with losing a child, even for a brief time. But that fear, however real, does not give anyone the right to accuse an innocent man." Michael walked closer to the jury box, his voice lowering as he spoke. "We must remember that fear and prejudice can cloud judgment. This isn't just about fear for her missing son. This is about racial prejudice. We are in a courtroom where a white woman's accusation is being taken as fact, without any evidence, simply because the accused is a black man." There was a palpable shift in the room, the mention of racial bias stirring an uncomfortable silence. Michael didn't linger on the point, but it hung in the air, undeniable. Darren has lived in this neighborhood for years. He is a dedicated father, a loving husband, and a respected member of this community. He has no criminal history, no record of violent behavior, nothing that aligns with the heinous accusations being thrown at him. He turned toward the judge, then the jury, his voice rising in determination. "So, why are we here? Why is Darren being treated like a dangerous criminal when there is not a shred of evidence linking him to this so-called kidnapping?" Michael gestured to Darren, who sat quietly at the defense table, his eyes steady but filled with disbelief at the ordeal he was enduring. "Look at this man. He is a father, just like any other. His children are sitting right there, wondering why their dad is being treated like a criminal for something he did not do." The jury's eyes followed Michael's hand toward Maria and their children, seated quietly, their faces drawn with worry. The emotional weight of Sarah's testimony was beginning to lose its grip as Michael methodically dismantled the weak foundation her claims stood on. "Let's be clear," Michael continued. "This entire case is built on one thing: assumption. Assumptions based on fear and, unfortunately, racial bias. But assumptions are not evidence. And in this country, we are innocent until proven guilty. Where is the proof?" The courtroom remained quiet, the tension shifting now as the defense began to build momentum. Michael returned to his seat, but not before leaving the jury with a final thought. You cannot convict a man based on fear and speculation. You need evidence. And ladies and gentlemen, there is no evidence here. Darren is an innocent man. With that, Michael sat down beside Darren, who nodded quietly, appreciating the calm but powerful defense of his character. Yet, the trial was far from over, and though the seeds of doubt had been planted, the fight for Darren's freedom had only just begun. But as the courtroom braced for the next phase of the trial, the question lingered. How long could Sarah's story hold up when it was built on nothing but thin air? From the very beginning, there was an uneasy feeling in the courtroom. Judge Simmons, a man with a reputation for stern rulings, seemed to exhibit a subtle yet unmistakable bias. Each time Sarah spoke, his expression softened, and his tone carried a level of sympathy that wasn't afforded to Darren or his defense team. Darren's attorney, Michael, began to pick up on the subtle signs. When the prosecution made a point, the judge nodded along. But when the defense raised legitimate questions about the lack of evidence, Judge Simmons appeared dismissive. His rulings on objections consistently seemed to favor the prosecution, allowing Sarah's emotional testimony to hold more weight than the lack of facts behind it. Michael and his team exchanged wary glances. It was becoming clear that this trial wasn't just about Darren defending himself against Sarah's accusations. He was also fighting against a biased system. The racial undertones in the courtroom were impossible to ignore, and Judge Simmons's demeanor made it clear that Darren wasn't getting the impartial judgment he deserved. As the trial dragged on, the tension in the courtroom grew heavier. The defense team anticipated an uphill battle. They were up against more than just an emotional story. They were battling an ingrained bias that had begun to cloud the judge's decisions. Darren, sitting silently beside his attorney, could feel it too. He was trapped in a system that wasn't built to favor men like him, especially when the accuser was a wealthy white woman. But Michael wasn't ready to give up. He could sense the unfairness in the air, but he had faced these battles before. There was still hope, even if it felt like they were inching closer to a rigged conclusion. As the trial continued, it was becoming a test of endurance, not just for Darren, but for the truth. The tension in the courtroom took on a new dimension when John, Sarah's husband, was called to the stand. John, a quiet man who had remained largely in the background throughout the proceedings, now found himself under the spotlight. John's testimony was supposed to reinforce Sarah's claims, but as soon as he took the stand, something seemed off. His body language was stiff, and though he supported Sarah's account, there was a palpable discomfort in his demeanor. He kept his eyes down, rarely making eye contact with the jury or the defense team. I was at work when it happened, John began, his voice shaky. Sarah called me, crying, saying Ethan was missing. She was sure Darren had something to do with it. The defense team watched John carefully, sensing his hesitation. Michael observed the slight tremor in John's hands, the way his eyes darted to Sarah, as if he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. There was something beneath the surface, something unspoken, but Michael couldn't quite put his finger on it. When the defense attorney pressed John for more details, his answers were vague. He stood by his wife's accusations, but his words felt rehearsed, lacking the conviction of a man who truly believed what he was saying. Darren, watching from the defense table, clenched his jaw in frustration. It was clear that John knew something that wasn't being said, but the defense had no proof, no leverage to dig deeper. John's testimony, while technically supportive of Sarah's story, did more to raise questions than provide clarity. His hesitation, his discomfort. There was an air of guilt, a sense that he was hiding something vital. The defense team could feel it, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do but wait and hope for a break. As John stepped down from the stand, the weight of the unknown lingered in the air. Darren, trapped by the constraints of the legal system and the lies woven around him, could only watch helplessly. The truth was out there, just beyond reach, but as the trial continued, it seemed more obscured than ever. The trial, already clouded by Judge Simmons's bias and Sarah's emotional manipulation, now had another layer of mystery. Michael knew that time was running out, and the pressure to reveal the truth, whatever John might be hiding, was more intense than ever. While Darren sat in the courtroom day after day, defending himself against Sarah's baseless accusations, his family endured a different kind of torment outside its walls. The same neighbors who once greeted them with smiles and small talk had turned cold, their gazes heavy with suspicion. The whispers, the pointed fingers, and the sideways glances, they were constant reminders that the neighborhood had already convicted Darren in their minds. Maria, Darren's wife, bore the brunt of this isolation. Everywhere she went, people avoided her, their faces twisted with distrust. She could hear them talk when they thought she wasn't listening. The once friendly neighborhood had become a hostile environment. The accusations against Darren had poisoned their community, and Maria and their 2 children were now paying the price. Walking her children to school had become a nightmare. Their kids, once popular and carefree, now faced teasing and bullying from classmates who parroted the words they heard from their parents. "Your dad's a kidnapper," one child whispered harshly to Darren's daughter on the playground. "He's going to jail forever." The words cut deeper than anything Maria could shield her children from, and watching their confidence slowly crumble broke her heart. At night, Maria sat at the dinner table, struggling to put on a brave face as her children asked when their father would come home. She wanted to reassure them, to tell them that everything would be okay, but deep down, the weight of uncertainty crushed her. What if Darren was found guilty? What if her family would forever be branded by a crime that never even happened? The isolation was unbearable, but Maria had no choice but to remain strong, for her children, for Darren, and for the life they had built together. Every day was a battle, and every moment, she felt the weight of the accusation pushing her further into despair. Yet despite the pressure, she refused to let her family fall apart. Maria knew that the truth was on their side, but as the days passed, it seemed the world around her was determined to turn a blind eye. Back in the courtroom, Darren's defense attorney, Michael, had been waiting for this moment. After days of emotional testimony and mounting pressure, it was time to introduce a key piece of evidence that could change the course of the trial, Darren's alibi. Michael stood confidently before the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, while we have heard a great deal of speculation and emotion in this courtroom, we have yet to see any evidence linking my client, Darren, to this crime." He paused, letting his words settle before delivering the blow. Because the truth is, Darren could not have committed the crime he's being accused of. He wasn't even there. The room stirred as Michael revealed the details of the alibi. On the night of the supposed kidnapping, Darren had been miles away from Sarah's home, at a local convenience store. Multiple witnesses had seen him there, and the defense had gathered statements to confirm it. Michael gestured toward the witness stand, where the first of several store employees was brought forward. They testified to seeing Darren enter the store at the exact time Sarah claimed her son had gone missing. The witness described Darren's calm demeanor as he made a purchase, even offering a receipt with the timestamp as proof. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. It was hard evidence, cold, hard facts, that contradicted Sarah's accusations. And yet, as Michael looked toward Judge Simmons, he saw a familiar expression. The judge was reluctant, almost dismissive. "Your Honor, we have multiple witnesses and verifiable proof that my client was not anywhere near Sarah's house at the time in question," Michael pressed. "This alibi is undeniable." But Judge Simmons didn't seem convinced. His face remained impassive, and he seemed hesitant to fully acknowledge the weight of the alibi. The tension in the room grew, as Darren's defense team could feel the judge's bias once again looming over the proceedings. Despite the strength of the evidence, it became clear that Michael was fighting an uphill battle, not just against the prosecution but against the very system that was supposed to ensure Darren received a fair trial. The racial undertones that had clouded the trial from the start were now more apparent than ever. The jury listened, but the judge's demeanor sent a subtle message. Darren's innocence wasn't as important as protecting the narrative that had already been built around Sarah's story. Michael knew they had presented a crucial piece of evidence, but the question lingered. Would it be enough to cut through the bias and prejudice that seemed determined to overshadow the truth? The trial was moving forward, each side presenting its case with a sense of urgency. Darren's defense had introduced an airtight alibi, but the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense. Then, without warning, a shocking development turned the entire case upside down. As the court proceedings resumed one morning, whispers erupted in the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the reason for the commotion soon became clear. Sarah's son, Ethan, had been found. The boy had not been kidnapped at all. Instead, he had wandered off that evening and, confused and scared, ended up at the home of a distant family friend in another town. The friend, not realizing the severity of the situation, had taken the boy in, assuming Sarah would contact them soon. Days passed before the friend saw the media coverage and came forward with the boy. The courtroom was stunned. The idea that Ethan had never been kidnapped in the first place left everyone reeling. Gasps filled the room as the prosecution delivered the news. But while many were shocked and relieved, Sarah stood firm, her face set in a mixture of fear and defiance. "I told you," Sarah said, her voice rising, eyes wild as she looked toward the jury. "I know Darren had something to do with this. He must have helped hide Ethan." Michael and Darren exchanged glances. The discovery of the boy should have ended the case right there, but Sarah wasn't backing down. Despite the overwhelming evidence that no kidnapping had occurred, she doubled down on her accusation, insisting that Darren had somehow orchestrated the disappearance. It was a surreal moment. Ethan was safe, and yet Sarah's desperation to pin the blame on Darren remained relentless. Her unwavering accusations cast a shadow over the relief of the boy's safe return, keeping the trial alive despite the new revelation. With Ethan found unharmed, the entire courtroom expected the case against Darren to fall apart. Yet, Sarah's emotional grip on the proceedings had left an indelible mark. Even though it was now clear that no kidnapping had taken place, Judge Simmons allowed the trial to continue, as Sarah continued to push the narrative that Darren had been involved somehow. Michael, sensing the unraveling of Sarah's story, stood to address the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, there is no crime here. No kidnapping. Darren didn't take Ethan, and we now know that. The boy simply wandered off, as children sometimes do." He paused, letting the weight of the truth settle in the room. "We have wasted this man's time, damaged his reputation, and put his family through immense suffering, all based on an accusation that was nothing more than a fabrication fueled by fear and prejudice." The defense team made it clear that the real story was beginning to unfold. Sarah's accusations were baseless, and Darren had been targeted for no other reason than the color of his skin. The boy's safe return should have marked the end of the trial, but the judge's face remained as rigid as ever. Sarah, sitting tense in her chair, refused to let the truth sway her. She insisted on Darren's guilt, her emotions taking over as she repeated her claims that Darren had to be involved, despite all the evidence to the contrary. But for the first time, the jury began to hesitate. The once ironclad emotional bond Sarah had created with them was weakening. The boy was safe, and it was becoming harder to justify why they were all still sitting in the courtroom. Yet, Judge Simmons seemed unwilling to dismiss the case. His sympathies still appeared to lean toward Sarah, and his reluctance to acknowledge the absurdity of the accusations was troubling. It was as though the emotional weight of Sarah's testimony had clouded his ability to see the case for what it really was, a tragic misunderstanding driven by prejudice. The tension in the room was thick. While some members of the jury began to question Sarah's version of events, others remained unsure. Doubt had crept into the courtroom, but the trial wasn't over yet. Darren, his defense team, and his family watched with bated breath, knowing that despite the truth being revealed, they were still fighting an uphill battle. Michael knew that if they were going to secure Darren's freedom, they needed to break through the judge's bias and fully expose Sarah's motives. The boy's safe return was a victory, but it was only the beginning. The hardest part, the final push for justice, was yet to come. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Maria, Darren's wife, took the stand. All eyes were on her as she sat down, adjusting the microphone nervously. She had been the quiet pillar of strength for her family throughout the trial, but today, her voice would be heard. As the defense attorney, Michael, began his questioning, Maria's calm resolve shone through. She spoke softly but with conviction. "I've known Darren for over 15 years. He's a good man, a loving father. He's never hurt anyone, and he's certainly not capable of what he's being accused of." Maria described the loving home they had built, the way Darren doted on their children, and how devastated they were by the accusations. She told the jury about the life they led before this nightmare began. How Darren was a pillar of the community, always ready to help his neighbors. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke of the impact the trial had on their family. "Our children are scared. They don't understand why their father, the man they look up to, is being treated like a criminal. And the worst part is, they've seen how people have turned on us." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But Darren has remained strong through it all. He didn't do this. He couldn't." The jury listened intently as Maria's words began to shift the tone of the courtroom. The raw truth in her voice contrasted sharply with the emotionally charged, but factless, testimony from Sarah. Where Sarah's narrative had been filled with fear and assumption, Maria's was grounded in the reality of Darren's character. As she finished her testimony, a noticeable shift swept through the room. Doubt about Sarah's credibility began to spread. For the first time, the jurors seemed to truly question whether Darren could be the villain Sarah painted him to be. Maria had spoken not just from the heart, but with a truth that resonated beyond the emotional theatrics of the trial. When Maria stepped down, there was a quiet respect for her in the room. Darren, sitting quietly at the defense table, met her eyes with a look of gratitude and hope. It wasn't over yet, but the foundation of Sarah's story was starting to crack. Now it was Darren's turn. After days of sitting in silence, being judged and scrutinized by a community that had turned against him, he finally had the chance to tell his story. He took the stand with a quiet dignity, his face tired but determined. The weight of everything he had endured was visible in his every movement. The courtroom was eerily silent as Michael began to question him. "Darren, can you tell us how these accusations have affected you and your family?" Darren took a deep breath. "This has been the hardest time of my life," he began, his voice low but steady. "I've spent years building a life for my family, working hard, being there for my kids. And in an instant, all of that was taken away by a lie." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I love my family. I've always done my best to provide for them, to protect them. But ever since this accusation, we've been treated like outcasts. My children have been bullied. My wife, she's had to hold everything together while I sit here, fighting for my freedom." Darren's eyes swept over the jury, his gaze filled with pain. "I didn't do what Sarah says I did. I wasn't even there. But because of who I am, because of the color of my skin, people were ready to believe the worst about me without any proof." The courtroom remained in complete silence, the weight of his words sinking in. There was no anger in Darren's voice, only deep sadness and frustration. He wasn't just defending himself, he was pleading for justice and fairness, for his children to have their father back, for his family to be able to live in peace once more. "I have spent my whole life trying to be a good man," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But now, no matter how hard I try, I can't convince people of the truth. My family has suffered enough. We've been through enough. I just want my life back. I just want this to be over." As Darren finished, his eyes fell to the table, and he took a deep, shaky breath. The courtroom remained silent for several long moments. His testimony had pierced through the emotional fog of the trial, laying bare the pain and trauma that he and his family had endured. For the first time, the jury saw Darren not as the accused, but as a victim, a man unjustly dragged through hell by a baseless accusation. His words had done more than challenge Sarah's story. They had revealed the true cost of her lies. Just when it seemed that the trial was reaching its emotional peak, Darren's defense team uncovered a crucial piece of evidence that would shift the entire case in their favor. Michael, Darren's attorney, stood before the court with a look of determination. "Your Honor, we have new evidence to present that directly challenges the accusations made against my client." The courtroom stirred, and the tension was palpable as Michael explained the discovery. A neighbor's security camera, previously thought to be non-operational, had captured footage on the night of Ethan's disappearance. The defense had obtained the footage, and what it revealed was a major turning point in the trial. With the judge's permission, the footage was displayed for the court to see. As the video played, it showed the quiet street in front of Sarah's house on the night of the alleged kidnapping. The timestamp aligned with when Sarah claimed Darren had been lurking near her home. But the footage showed no such thing. There was no sign of Darren, or anyone else, near Sarah's house that night. Instead, the camera captured Ethan wandering off down the street, alone, confirming the defense's claim that the boy had simply left the house by himself. The courtroom buzzed with shock. Sarah's entire narrative was built on the idea that Darren had been at her house, acting suspiciously, and had taken her son. But the footage showed a completely different story, one where Darren wasn't involved at all. Michael let the weight of the footage settle in the courtroom before speaking. This footage clearly shows that Darren was never at Sarah's house. There was no suspicious activity. There was no kidnapping. This is the truth, and it directly contradicts everything we've heard so far. The jury watched the video closely, some exchanging glances as doubt about Sarah's claims began to grow. The footage was undeniable. It was the first concrete evidence that shattered the prosecution's case. Judge Simmons, who had previously seemed biased in favor of Sarah, was now forced to acknowledge the new evidence. The courtroom had shifted. What once seemed like a hopeless case for Darren was now turning in his favor. As the new evidence was laid bare for the entire courtroom to see, the carefully constructed facade of Sarah's story began to unravel. The truth, caught on camera, was impossible to deny. Darren hadn't been anywhere near her house that night, and there was no evidence to support her claim that he had kidnapped her son. When Michael rose to begin the cross-examination, Sarah's confident exterior began to crack. "Mrs. Taylor," he began, his voice firm but calm, "the footage clearly shows that Darren was not near your house on the night you claim he took your son. Can you explain how your version of events contradicts what we've just seen?" Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the edges of the witness stand. Her eyes darted around the courtroom, but no one came to her rescue. She stammered, struggling to find the right words. I thought I saw him," she muttered. "It was dark. I was sure it was him." But Michael pressed on. "You didn't see him, did you? This video proves that. Your son wasn't taken by Darren. He wandered off on his own. Yet you accused Darren anyway, knowing there was no proof to back your claim. Why?" Sarah's face flushed with panic, and her carefully composed demeanor crumbled. Under the weight of the cross-examination and the overwhelming evidence, she could no longer keep her story straight. Her contradictions piled up as she tried to backtrack, making statements that directly opposed her earlier testimony. The courtroom watched as Sarah's lies were slowly exposed. Every attempt she made to defend herself only dug her deeper into a hole. She had accused an innocent man of a heinous crime, and now her deception was unraveling for everyone to see. Michael delivered the final blow. "Mrs. Taylor, isn't it true that your accusation against Darren was based on fear and prejudice, not facts? Isn't it true that you were afraid of him simply because of who he is?" Sarah's face paled as she realized the walls were closing in. Her story, built on false assumptions and racial bias, was collapsing before her eyes. There was no way out now. The truth was out, and the courtroom knew it. By the time Michael was finished, Sarah sat silent, her earlier confidence replaced by desperation and shame. The jury, once sympathetic to her, now looked at her with suspicion. The narrative she had spun was coming apart, and there was no saving it. Darren, who had suffered so much at the hands of these false accusations, could finally see a glimmer of hope. The tide had turned, and now, justice seemed within reach. With Sarah's story falling apart, Michael knew it was time to reveal the underlying truth that had fueled this entire nightmare: Sarah's racial bias. Up until now, her accusations had been painted as a mother's fear for her child, but the defense had uncovered a darker motivation behind her actions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Michael began, pacing slowly in front of them, "this case has never been about a real kidnapping. It's been about fear, but not fear for her child, fear of her black neighbor. And that fear, deeply rooted in prejudice, is what drove Mrs. Taylor to falsely accuse an innocent man." The defense called several witnesses to the stand. Neighbors who had overheard Sarah making remarks about Darren and his family in the months leading up to the trial. One by one, they testified about her discomfort with having a black family living next door. One neighbor recounted a conversation where Sarah complained, "I don't feel safe with them so close. You never know what those people are capable of." Another neighbor testified that Sarah had once suggested that Darren's children shouldn't be playing outside so close to her yard. She said they were too loud. But we all knew what she really meant. Michael's voice was steady but forceful. These comments reveal something crucial about this case. Sarah's accusations were never about Ethan's safety. They were about her discomfort with Darren and his family simply because they were black. The courtroom was silent as the weight of these revelations set in. Sarah's face turned pale as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Her defense had no rebuttal to offer. The truth was now clear for everyone to see. Michael turned to the jury. Sarah Taylor weaponized her fear and her bias, and in doing so, she nearly destroyed the life of a good man. Darren was not the villain in this story. The real villain was the prejudice that clouded Sarah's judgment and led to these false accusations. With each witness testimony, it became more apparent that Sarah's accusation was not about protecting her son, but about punishing a black man for daring to live peacefully next to her. This case was no longer about a mother seeking justice. It was about exposing the racial bias that had turned Darren into a scapegoat. As the truth about Sarah's motives began to surface in the courtroom, the story gained traction beyond the walls of the courthouse. The media, initially focused on the sensational aspect of the alleged kidnapping, started to report on the racial dynamics at play. News outlets ran stories highlighting the racial bias at the heart of the case, and soon, the trial became a flashpoint for conversations about race and justice. Outside the courthouse, protests began to form. Crowds gathered with signs that read "Justice for Darren" and "End Racial Prejudice." People from all walks of life showed up to stand in solidarity with Darren and his family, demanding that the system recognize the injustice he had endured. What had started as a neighborhood case was now a symbol of a much larger issue: systemic racism in the legal system. The more the media covered the trial, the more people were drawn to Darren's story. His wrongful arrest and the racial bias that had fueled it resonated with many, and the community began to rally around him in ways he hadn't expected. Even people who had once kept their distance from his family now offered support, ashamed of the way they had judged him based on Sarah's false narrative. As the protests grew, so did the pressure on the court. The once small, private trial had turned into a national story, and the world was watching. Darren's family, once isolated and harassed, now had the backing of an entire community and beyond. Maria and their children, who had been quietly suffering throughout the ordeal, were finally beginning to feel a sense of hope. The public support for Darren had not only lifted their spirits, but had also changed the way the legal system treated the case. With the spotlight on them, the court could no longer ignore the racial bias that had led to Darren's wrongful arrest. The courtroom, once filled with tension and uncertainty, was now filled with anticipation. The world was demanding justice for Darren, and the pressure was mounting on the judge and jury to make things right. Outside, the chants of protesters filled the air. No justice, no peace. It was clear that this case was no longer just about Darren. It was about standing up against the racial injustice that had plagued the community for far too long. The tide was turning, and it was only a matter of time before the truth prevailed. The courtroom had reached a boiling point. After weeks of mounting evidence, racial bias revelations, and public protests, the tension in the air was thick. But nothing could have prepared the court for what was about to unfold. As John, Sarah's husband, took the stand again, it was clear something had changed. His once reserved demeanor had given way to nervousness, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing quickly at Sarah, whose gaze burned into him, silently urging him to stick to their story. But the weight of the truth, along with the growing pressure from the courtroom and the public, had finally become too much for John to bear. Taking a deep breath, John looked out at the sea of expectant faces in the courtroom. His voice cracked as he began to speak. I can't do this anymore," he said, his words trembling. "I need to tell the truth." The courtroom went still, as if everyone had collectively held their breath. Even Sarah, who had controlled the narrative up until this point, was now frozen in shock, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. "I knew all along that Ethan wasn't kidnapped," John confessed, his voice barely above a whisper but loud enough to echo through the courtroom. "He wandered off that night. He just walked away. There was no kidnapping." Gasps rippled through the room. Darren and his defense team exchanged shocked looks, hardly able to believe what they were hearing. John continued, his voice filled with regret. "When Sarah panicked and accused Darren, I didn't say anything. I went along with it because I didn't want us to look bad. I didn't want people to think we were irresponsible parents, that we lost track of our own child." The weight of his admission hung heavily in the room as John's eyes welled with tears. "I should have told the truth from the beginning, but I didn't. And because of that, an innocent man has suffered." The courtroom exploded into murmurs, disbelief, and whispers. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. the unraveling of Sarah's lie, and the admission that Darren had been wrongfully accused from the start. John's confession shattered any remaining credibility Sarah had left. Sarah, for the first time since the trial began, looked truly frightened. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Judge Simmons, who had maintained a stern and somewhat biased demeanor throughout the trial, now sat in stunned silence. His face, usually unreadable, showed clear signs of disbelief as John's confession sunk in. For weeks, the judge had subtly favored Sarah's emotional testimony, allowing her accusations to carry more weight than they should have. But now, with John's confession and the overwhelming evidence that had been presented, the security footage, the lack of any real kidnapping, he realized just how badly the case had been mishandled. The courtroom was buzzing, but Judge Simmons raised his hand for silence. The room quieted immediately, all eyes on him as he adjusted his glasses, clearly trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Taylor," he began slowly, his voice measured but filled with shock, "are you telling this court that you knew your son wasn't kidnapped, but you allowed your wife to accuse Mr. Daniels anyway?" John nodded, his head hanging low in shame. "Yes, Your Honor. I knew." For a long moment, the judge said nothing, the gravity of John's confession hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Judge Simmons turned toward Darren, who had been sitting quietly, absorbing the emotional roller coaster of the trial. The judge's previous bias seemed to melt away, replaced by a dawning sense of regret for how the case had been handled. The overwhelming evidence of Darren's innocence, coupled with John's confession, had completely shifted the tide of the trial. Judge Simmons could no longer deny that Darren had been wrongfully accused, and that Sarah's baseless accusations had been fueled by lies and racial prejudice. The judge's voice, once firm and harsh, now softened. "Mr. Daniels," he said, addressing Darren directly, "it is clear that a great injustice has been done to you and your family. This court has failed you." The words, though spoken softly, carried immense weight. The courtroom, once filled with tension and uncertainty, had finally reached a turning point. Darren, who had been fighting for his freedom and his dignity for so long, could feel the tide turning in his favor at last. The truth had finally come out, and with it, the beginning of Darren's long-awaited justice. As the trial reached its final moments, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Darren, his family, and the public watched anxiously as the jury, now tasked with deciding his fate, retreated to begin their deliberations. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The courtroom, once alive with the noise of testimony and evidence, now felt like a vacuum, empty, yet heavy with anticipation. Maria sat beside her children, gripping their hands tightly, her eyes fixed on the door where the jury had disappeared moments earlier. Darren remained stoic, his face unreadable, but inside, his heart pounded as he braced himself for whatever was to come. Outside, the protesters who had gathered in support of Darren filled the streets, chanting for justice. Signs demanding an end to racial prejudice and calling for Darren's freedom waved in the air, as the world waited for a verdict that would either confirm or reject the injustice Darren had endured. Hours passed, and the tension in the courtroom only grew. The longer the jury took, the more uncertain the outcome seemed. Michael, Darren's attorney, sat beside him, quietly offering words of encouragement, but even he couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of all the pain, the lies, and the fight for justice. Finally, the courtroom doors opened. The jury, their faces solemn and serious, filed back into their seats. The room held its collective breath as Judge Simmons asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, holding a small slip of paper in her hand. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady but tense. The atmosphere was electric with uncertainty, as everyone in the room leaned forward, waiting to hear the decision that would determine the rest of Darren's life. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating as the foreperson unfolded the paper and cleared her throat. Darren sat motionless, his heart racing, while Maria held her breath beside him, her grip on her children's hands tightening. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Darren Daniels, not guilty on all charges." The words seemed to echo through the room, and for a moment, There was a stunned silence, the calm before the storm. Then, almost in unison, the courtroom erupted into a wave of relief and emotion. Darren's family burst into tears, hugging each other tightly as the weight of the injustice they had endured finally lifted. Maria rushed to Darren's side, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around him. Their children followed, clinging to their father as though they couldn't believe it was over. Darren, too overcome with emotion to speak, held his family close, feeling the overwhelming relief of freedom wash over him. The public gallery, filled with supporters, cheered as they witnessed justice finally being served. Outside the courthouse, the chants of protesters grew louder, their calls for justice turning into cries of victory. Signs waved high, and the crowd celebrated as word spread. Darren had been exonerated. Even Judge Simmons, who had appeared cold and biased throughout the trial, couldn't hide the gravity of the moment. His face softened, and he nodded toward Darren, acknowledging the wrong that had been done. "Mr. Daniels," the judge said, "you are free to go. This court deeply regrets the injustice you have endured." Darren, still holding on to his family, stood tall, his innocence finally affirmed. The nightmare that had started with a baseless accusation had come to an end, and Darren was now free, not only from the charges but from the shadow of false guilt that had haunted him. The courtroom, filled with emotions running high, reflected the reality of what had transpired. A man wrongfully accused, his life nearly destroyed, had been vindicated. The truth had prevailed, and Darren's innocence had been proven before the world. As Darren and his family left the courthouse, greeted by the cheers and support of the community, they knew this was more than just a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of justice, the importance of fighting against prejudice, and the resilience of a man who had refused to let lies define his life. As the gavel struck the bench, signaling the official end of the trial, Darren was overcome with an overwhelming rush of emotion. It was the first time in what felt like an eternity that he could finally breathe freely. The years of stress, fear, and the crushing weight of wrongful accusations had finally come to an end. He stood in the center of the courtroom, but for the first time, he felt truly free. His vision blurred with tears as he turned to embrace Maria, who was already rushing toward him, her arms outstretched. Their children followed closely behind, clinging to their father as if they were afraid he might slip away again. But Darren wasn't going anywhere, not anymore. The nightmare that had consumed their lives was over. "I told you I was coming home," Darren whispered into Maria's ear as they held each other tightly, tears streaming down both of their faces. The years of pain, isolation, and fighting for his innocence melted away in this one moment of triumph. His family was by his side, and his name had been cleared. Around them, their supporters clapped and cheered, but for Darren, everything else faded. All that mattered was the warmth of his family's embrace, the weight of the wrongful accusations finally lifted from his shoulders. After enduring so much, the relief was almost too much to process. Darren looked into the eyes of his children, their faces wet with tears of joy and relief, and smiled. He was no longer the man falsely accused of a crime he hadn't committed. He was their father, their protector, and their role model, free and vindicated. They had weathered this storm together, and now they could finally begin to heal. As they left the courthouse, Darren felt an unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace. The fight was over, and justice had been served. Now, he could look forward to the future, one where he no longer had to defend his character, but where he could rebuild the life that had nearly been taken from him. With Darren cleared of all charges, the public's focus quickly shifted to Sarah, the once sympathetic figure who had commanded attention and support with her emotional testimony, now found herself on the receiving end of outrage and scorn. As the full extent of her lies became evident, the community that had once stood by her began to turn against her. News outlets that had initially covered Sarah's accusations with fervor now reported on her disgrace. Headlines exposed the truth: how she had manipulated the story, used her privilege, and falsely accused an innocent man, all while knowing that her son hadn't been kidnapped at all. Sarah, once seen as a victim, was now being labeled as the architect of Darren's wrongful suffering. The public outrage grew with each passing day. Social media erupted, with people calling for Sarah to be held accountable for the damage she had caused. The court of public opinion was swift and unforgiving. She had nearly destroyed a man's life, and there were consequences for that. But it wasn't just the public's disdain that Sarah had to face. There were also the legal repercussions. With Darren exonerated, there were growing calls for Sarah to be charged with filing false accusations and defamation. What had started as her attempt to cover up her own failings as a parent had spiraled into a criminal matter. Now, Sarah stood to lose everything: the respect of her community, her social standing, and possibly even her freedom. The community that had once rallied around Sarah was now turning away from her, disgusted by her actions. Neighbors who had once whispered sympathetically about her plight now looked at her with contempt. Former friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the woman who had nearly ruined an innocent man's life. Sarah's fall from grace was swift and brutal. She no longer commanded the attention of the courtroom or the sympathy of the public. Instead, she was the object of scorn, the woman who had lied to save herself at the expense of someone else's life. As the full extent of her actions came to light, Sarah found herself isolated, her lies exposed for the world to see. The very lies she had built her case on had now destroyed her, and the community was quick to turn its back on her. Darren, meanwhile, could finally walk free, his innocence affirmed, his dignity restored. And while Sarah faced the consequences of her actions, Darren and his family looked toward a future filled with hope, healing, and the knowledge that justice had finally been served. With Darren's exoneration, attention quickly turned to those who had played pivotal roles in his wrongful accusation and trial, and Judge Simmons was at the top of that list. Throughout the trial, his clear bias against Darren, his dismissive attitude toward the defense, and his reluctance to acknowledge key pieces of evidence had left a stain on what was supposed to be an impartial process. Now, with Darren proven innocent, the judge's actions were being put under a microscope. Darren's defense team wasted no time in filing a formal complaint, demanding an investigation into Judge Simmons's conduct during the trial. The once respected judge now found himself at the center of a growing scandal. The courtroom's handling of Darren's case had exposed Simmons's racial bias, and the public was outraged. His decisions, which had seemed to unfairly lean in favor of Sarah, were now being questioned by legal experts and civil rights organizations. The media began to pick apart Simmons's history of rulings, uncovering other instances where black defendants had been treated with disproportionate harshness in his courtroom. What had once been whispered about behind closed doors was now a public spectacle. The protest that had originally formed in support of Darren now expanded to demand Judge Simmons's removal from the bench. Signs reading, "End judicial bias," and "No justice without accountability" filled the streets as people called for the judge to be held responsible for his clear mishandling of the trial. Inside the courthouse, Simmons remained silent, but the pressure continued to mount. Civil rights groups joined forces with Darren's defense team to push for a full investigation into the judge's decisions. A formal review of his conduct was initiated, and calls for his resignation grew louder with each passing day. As Simmons's legacy began to unravel, it became clear that Darren's case was just the beginning. The judge's bias had been exposed to the world, and the community's trust in him was shattered. His once untouchable reputation was now tarnished, and the people were demanding justice, not just for Darren, but for all those who had been unfairly treated in his courtroom over the years. Having endured years of wrongful accusations and the emotional and psychological toll of a biased trial, Darren wasn't about to let the people responsible for his suffering walk away without consequence. With the support of his legal team and the growing public attention surrounding his case, Darren filed a lawsuit against both Sarah and the local police department for wrongful arrest and defamation. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the media, capturing national attention. What had once been a local case now became a symbol of the dangers of false accusations, particularly those fueled by racial prejudice. Darren's story resonated with millions, as it highlighted the very real consequences of systemic racism within the legal system. His case wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It had become a catalyst for change. In his lawsuit, Darren sought damages for the wrongful arrest, the trauma inflicted upon him and his family, and the defamation of his character. He detailed the emotional and financial toll the accusations had taken on his life, how his business had suffered, how his family had been harassed, and how his reputation had been unfairly tarnished. Sarah, now facing both public disgrace and the potential legal consequences of her actions, found herself in a precarious position. Her once privileged life was crumbling, and the lawsuit only amplified the pressure on her to answer for the lies she had told. Meanwhile, the police department also faced scrutiny for their role in Darren's wrongful arrest. Their failure to investigate properly, coupled with their eagerness to act on Sarah's baseless accusations, became a focal point in Darren's lawsuit. The case drew attention from legal experts, civil rights advocates, and the public alike. News outlets covered every development, with many pointing to Darren's lawsuit as a watershed moment in the fight against racial prejudice within the legal system. Darren, once a victim of false accusations, was now at the forefront of a national conversation about justice, accountability, and the dangers of racial bias. As the lawsuit progressed, Darren's courage and resilience became a symbol of hope for others who had suffered similar injustices. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been wrongfully accused, everyone who had been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin. In the courtroom and beyond, Darren's lawsuit became a rallying cry for change, shining a spotlight on the systemic issues that had allowed his case to spiral out of control in the first place. And while the legal battle was far from over, Darren had already achieved something far greater than a personal victory. He had sparked a movement for justice and equality. With the trial behind him, Darren faced the daunting task of rebuilding his life. The weight of the false accusations, the trauma of his wrongful arrest, and the emotional toll of the courtroom battle had left deep scars. Yet, despite the lingering pain, Darren was determined not to let the experience define him. As he returned to his family and his community, Darren's focus shifted to reclaiming the life and reputation that had been nearly destroyed. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his construction business, reconnecting with clients and rebuilding the trust that had been shaken by the accusations. Though some in the community still viewed him with suspicion, many rallied around him, recognizing the strength and resilience he had shown throughout his ordeal. But Darren's journey wasn't just about personal recovery. The experience had ignited something deeper within him, a passion for racial justice and a determination to ensure that what had happened to him wouldn't happen to others. He began speaking out, sharing his story publicly as a cautionary tale about the dangers of racial prejudice and the failures of the legal system. Darren became a vocal advocate, attending rallies and speaking at community forums about the need for judicial reform and better police accountability. His words resonated with others who had faced similar injustices, and soon, he was invited to speak at larger events, his voice becoming a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless against a biased system. Though the trauma of the accusations still lingered, Darren found healing in his advocacy work. He had survived an unimaginable ordeal, and now, he was using his platform to fight for justice and equality. His story became a symbol of resilience, and Darren was no longer just a man who had been wrongfully accused. He was a man determined to make a difference. For Darren, life after the trial wasn't easy, but it was filled with purpose. He had regained his freedom and his dignity, and now, he was focused on ensuring that no one else would have to endure the same pain. His family stood by his side, proud of the man he had become, a man who had faced the worst and emerged stronger. While Darren worked to rebuild his life, Sarah faced a very different reality. Her once comfortable existence had crumbled around her, and the consequences of her false accusations were now coming home to roost. With the truth fully exposed and Darren exonerated, Sarah was found guilty of making false accusations and defamation. The court, recognizing the severe harm she had caused to Darren and his family, handed down a significant punishment. Sarah was ordered to pay substantial damages to Darren, a sum that would help him recover some of the financial losses he had suffered during the trial. But the consequences for Sarah went far beyond financial ruin. The once respected woman who had commanded sympathy from her community now found herself isolated and disgraced. Her lies, which had nearly destroyed an innocent man, had come back to haunt her. Friends distanced themselves, neighbors avoided her, and even her own family struggled to cope with the fallout. The public outrage that had once been directed at Darren had now turned on Sarah. Her name was forever tainted, associated with deceit and racial prejudice. The media, which had once treated her with sympathy, now portrayed her as a cautionary figure, a woman who had used her privilege and bias to ruin a man's life for her own selfish reasons. Sarah's life, once filled with privilege and security, was now in tatters. The weight of her lies followed her everywhere. She had lost not just her reputation but her sense of self, knowing that her actions had not only destroyed her own life but had deeply hurt an innocent man and his family. Despite her punishment, Sarah's fall from grace was the most devastating consequence of all. The woman who had once wielded her influence so easily now found herself alone, shunned by the very society she had once been a part of. The financial damages were only part of the price she paid. The real punishment was the shame and isolation that would follow her for the rest of her life. In the end, Sarah's lies had consumed her, leaving her with nothing but the ruins of the life she had once known. Darren had been vindicated, and she had been exposed for the fraud she was. It was a fitting punishment for someone who had so carelessly wielded false accusations, and the world would not soon forget her betrayal. In the aftermath of the trial, the once divided community began to reflect on the racial tensions that had fueled the entire case. For months, many of Darren's neighbors had turned their backs on him, assuming the worst simply because of the color of his skin. Fear and prejudice had clouded their judgment, and Sarah's false accusations had only deepened the division. Now, with the truth exposed and Darren fully exonerated, those same neighbors were forced to confront their own actions. Regret spread through the neighborhood as people realized they had been complicit in Darren's suffering. Those who had once whispered about Darren behind his back now expressed remorse, ashamed of the assumptions they had made without knowing the facts. One by one, former skeptics approached Maria and Darren, offering apologies and acknowledging the harm their silence or participation in the rumors had caused. For many, Darren's strength and resilience throughout the ordeal had become a source of inspiration. His calm determination to clear his name in the face of such overwhelming bias had left a mark on the community. A conversation about racial prejudice began to take root. The neighbors who had once been content with their biases were now questioning their beliefs and reflecting on how easily they had been swayed by Sarah's lies. Darren's story had sparked a much-needed dialogue about race, justice, and the consequences of false accusations. The community, once divided, began to heal, and Darren's innocence became a rallying point for those seeking change. Though the road to understanding was long, the neighborhood was finally taking its first steps toward reconciliation and confronting the racial tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface. Having endured one of the most harrowing experiences of his life, Darren knew he couldn't let his story end with his exoneration. His ordeal had highlighted the dangers of racial prejudice and the devastating impact of false accusations. Determined to make a difference, Darren launched a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of people falsely accused due to racial bias. The organization, built on Darren's passion for justice, quickly gained national attention. It provided legal assistance to those who had been wrongfully accused, especially in cases where racial bias had played a role. Darren's mission was clear: to prevent what had happened to him from happening to others. Darren's story began to resonate across the country, and soon he was invited to speak at conferences and events, sharing his experience as a powerful reminder of the need for judicial reform. His speeches were raw, emotional, and deeply personal, and they struck a chord with audiences everywhere. He spoke not just of his own suffering, but of the broader issue of systemic racism within the legal system and the urgent need for change. As Darren's influence grew, so did the reach of his organization. His nonprofit helped countless individuals, shining a light on cases that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Darren became a national figure in the fight against racial injustice, using his platform to call for legal reform and an end to racial profiling and bias in the courtroom. Through his work, Darren had turned his personal pain into a force for change, and his story became a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. His advocacy gave hope to those who had been wronged, and his voice became one of the most powerful in the fight for justice. Years after the trial, Darren, Maria, and their children had finally found the peace that had once seemed so elusive. Their lives, once overshadowed by false accusations, had been rebuilt on a foundation of truth, resilience, and love. The weight of the past had lifted, and the family could now focus on the future, one filled with promise, not fear. Darren's journey from being wrongfully accused to becoming a symbol of justice had left an indelible mark on his community and the nation. His story was not just one of personal triumph, but a reminder of the dangers of racial prejudice and the importance of standing up for the truth, no matter the odds. His legacy continued to grow, inspiring others to fight against injustice and to question the biases that had once gone unchallenged. Darren's nonprofit thrived, helping countless individuals who had been wrongly accused, and his name became synonymous with the fight for fairness and equality. In the years that followed, Darren's case became a part of legal history, a landmark example of how the justice system could fail when clouded by bias, and how it could be redeemed through perseverance and the pursuit of truth. As the sun set on a quiet evening, Darren and Maria sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. The world around them had changed, and so had they. They had fought through the darkness of false accusations and come out the other side stronger than ever. Darren's legacy of justice would continue long after he was gone, a testament to the power of truth, resilience, and love. The story closed with a powerful message. Prejudice, when unchecked, can destroy lives, but the courage to stand up for what is right can change the course of history. Darren's name would forever be remembered as a beacon of hope for those seeking justice in an unjust world.
I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you.